And that's why you can actually come to identify yourself as a human being who has forgotten who you are. Your conscious self can forget who you are. This doesn't change who you are because, as I said, your higher being is anchored beyond the material universe. So even if you think you are an evolved monkey or a miserable sinner, it does not affect your real self. You are who you are, no matter who you think you are. But the problem is that who you think you are will affect how you behave and how you experience the world. So if you think you are just a highly evolved monkey, well, how can you have a real sense of purpose in life? If you think you're a miserable sinner, how can you really enjoy life? How can you have a sense of peace? How can you fulfill your role as a co-creator if you deny your God-given abilities? So you see what I'm getting at here. Number one, you have a built-in ability to experience God. There's nothing mystical or otherworldly about it. It's simply a matter of becoming more aware of your mind's ability to tune itself to the higher vibrations that are beyond the material world. And you can do this because you have a higher part of your own being that is beyond the material world. It's a perfectly natural process. But here comes the catch. In order to really make use of that ability, you have to first come to see your mortal, earthly sense of identity. You have to realize that it's unreal because it is built on duality. And then you have to decide that you are willing to go beyond it. You're willing to question it. You're willing to question the basic assumptions that you have so far taken for granted because they have become so ingrained in your mind that you identify yourself based on those assumptions. And that can be a difficult task for many people, depending on how attached you are to your ego's sense of security. Because you have to be willing to go beyond that sense of security in order to question who you are, in order to question your basic assumptions about life. Now this leads to a very important conclusion here. There are people out there who claim to be spiritual teachers who will say, "Oh, I can give you an experience of God." There are even those who say that if you take the right drugs, you will have an experience of God. Or do meditation, or participate in some kind of retreat or some kind of magical technique, you will experience God. But do you see the implications of what I've just told you? Your real self, the core of your being, is the conscious self. That conscious self is an extension of God's being. Therefore, experiencing God's being is perfectly natural for your conscious self. It is natural for your conscious self to experience that you are an extension of a greater being. This is actually the natural state of consciousness for a human being. What is unnatural is that you have forgotten this experience, that you have come to identify yourself as a limited, mortal human being. And the reason for that is that you have built a sense of identity based on the things on earth, the illusions of the material universe, the density of matter, and the illusions created from the duality consciousness, which has these basic paradigms and assumptions that you are never allowed to question. So do you see what I'm saying here? You don't need to do anything to experience God. You actually need to stop doing. Because what you have been programmed to do by the duality consciousness is to think that you always have to do something. You even see how some religions say that you have to do something in order to qualify for salvation. What you really have to do is to stop doing and get back to who you are, so you can be who you are. You can be the being that God created as an extension of itself. And here comes the tricky part. How do you then do that? How do you be? Well, because we have been so programmed to think that we have to do, we have to think, you might actually have to do, quote unquote, some work in order to undo that programming, in order to overcome that focus on the material world. You see what I'm saying? We are so used to thinking that we have to do. We are so used to looking for something outside ourselves that it might take almost a retooling of the mind in order to get away from that pattern of doing, of always looking outside ourselves, and actually focus within. And this is a process that might actually take some time. What I'm basically trying to say here is, let's go back to the radio analogy. You know that when you try to tune the radio to a certain station, sometimes there can be weather conditions that create a disturbance in the atmosphere. So all you get is static. You don't get a clear signal. You just hear all this noise. Well, basically what I'm saying is that your mind has been so filled with the concepts and the energies of the material world that there's so much static in your mind that when you try to tune the dial to the frequencies of your higher being, you can't get a clear connection. You can't penetrate that noise in your mind. And so what you might have to do is to actually make an effort to clear out some of that noise, to clear out the static in your mind that prevents you from tuning in to your higher being and having a clear experience of that higher being and the spiritual realm. And that might take some work, depending on who you are, depending on what you've experienced in your life. And that is actually a process that has been defined by our spiritual teachers as the spiritual path, where you walk a gradual path of clearing your mind, clearing your energy field of imperfect energies. I actually have another video called Clearing Your Energy Field of Toxic Energies, where I talk about this, or give a technique rather, for clearing your energy field. But there are many other techniques that you can use. You see, clearing your mind has two aspects. Your mind is filled with two things that create static. One is imperfect beliefs, imperfect ideas, images, mental images created from the duality consciousness that give you a warped sense of who you are, who God is, and what the world is, and what the world is like. We have all been brought up with thousands of these. Even if we were brought up in a non-religious environment, we were brought up with many imperfect concepts about who we are and what the world is. As I said, you are not a monkey. Neither were you created as a sinner. Why would God create an extension of itself that was predisposed to sin? Sin is a result of free will. Your free will choices, you have free will. But nevertheless, you are not a sinner, you are not a monkey, you are not a limited human being. You are a spiritual being. And so what you have to do is overcome some of these illusions. Same thing with the world. The world is not limited to the material spectrum of frequencies. There are many higher frequencies that we can learn to use. We can learn to bring them in through the powers of our minds, so we can use them to enrich our lives. We can even collectively enrich the entire planet and create a much more abundant form of life, where you don't have to have 2/3 of the people on this planet living below the poverty level, for you have abundance for all. These are some of the possibilities when we unlock the God-given abilities that our minds have to co-create the kingdom of God on earth.